Socrates is one of the most renowned and well known figures in history. He was one of the most remarkable thinkers of all time, and his philosophical legacy continues to be researched, studied, and debated all over the world. Despite becoming an extremely well known figure, Socrates did not found a school nor did he write anything with his own hand. What we know about his life and philosophy has come down to us through other authors, three of whom are considered the main ones: Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon. The first is certainly the best. Plato, he is known as the Socrates' pupil and also became a very important philosopher whose philosophical legacy is also of enormous value. These three authors portrayed Socrates in diverse ways. Plato, who lived between 428 to 448 BC, and Xenophon, who lived between 430 to 355 BC, proved to be great admirers of Socrates. The greatest Greek playwright Aristophanes, on the other hand, had a very less favorable view of the Athenian philosopher. Aristophanes deals with Socrates in a comedy from 343 BC entitled The Clouds, where the Greek thinker is ridiculed and considered a false sage as well as seen as a corrupter of youth and disrespectful to the gods in his philosophy. Aristophanes also presents Socrates as a sophist, but we should not forget that this playwright wrote some of the most famous comedies of ancient times. Hence the caricatured style he used to portray the philosopher, although we don't know his exact intentions. Aristophanes' writings are especially important for learning about the life of the greatest Greek philosopher. Despite Socrates being negatively characterized by Aristophanes, he wrote things that are remarkably similar to the Xenophon. And Plato, for example, he mentions dialectics as a communicative tool used by Socrates. He also mentions the well-known Socratic method through which the philosopher questioned his counterparts. The play, The Clouds, contains some interesting and significant biographical characteristics of Socrates, who is described as a simple poor man who walked barefoot and lived in a very modest house. In fact, Socrates' humility was one of the main hallmarks of his life, and also cited in other sources. In the memorable thoughts of the Socrates, Xenophon wrote that he has no slaves. His food and drinks are not executed, and his clothing is only a coarse cloak in summer and winter, and he has no shoes or tunic. In addition to these three authors, particularly important ones have mentioned Socrates as a Diogenes, Laertius, or Cicero, as well as Aristotle, another brilliant Greek philosopher, by combining the descriptions of these three writers. And the researchers, it has been possible to construct the trajectory of Socrates' life and philosophy. Socrates was born in Athens in 1469 BC, and his father was a sculptor. Sisk, his mother was the midwife Federate, and some paintings, frescoes, and sculptures help us to better understand what the philosopher looked like physically. And it seems he was not particularly beautiful, but this detail is insignificant when compared to mastery of his thought and the greatness of his philosophical legacy. He was attractive enough for his Ziti, whom he married, and had a son called Namle. According to some sources, he had two children with another wife. He was averse to luxury, dressing simply and shabbily, leading a modest life without attaching importance to material possession. These traits became his trademark. At times, his behavior was odd, attracting the attention of some of his contemporaries. On some occasions, he would stand still and meditate, remaining in his state for a long time. It was as if the philosopher noticed and felt nothing else around him, contemplating only his thoughts. In the dialogue of the symposium, Plato recounted some of these traits of the philosopher. He wrote that Socrates was resilient to low temperatures and on some occasions, while others were protecting themselves from frost, the philosopher could face them outdoors wearing only a blanket. What's more, he walked barefoot on the ice and didn't seem to feel cold underfoot. Once in the pool in 1432 BC, he reportedly spent 24 hours paralyzed looking at the horizon, reflecting on some ideas, something that impressed the soldiers camped with the philosopher. There also in the symposium, Plato tells that the master drank alcohol like no other man and yet was never seen drunk for a period of his life. Socrates tried to follow the same career path as his father, but was unsuccessful as a sculptor. During his youth, he was served in the military and took part in the Pelian War, a conflict between the cities of Athens and Sparta. Began in 431 and ended in 404 BC. He received a great deal of recognition for his heroism. But as we know today, his destiny was different philosophy. One of the great landmarks of Socratic philosophy is the exceedingly popular Phase 1. I know that I know nothing in a Platonic dialogue. Socrates recounting the origin of his famous quote on one occasion, Charon, a childhood friend of his consultant, the oracle of Delphi, a place considered sacred to the Greeks where people consulted their destinies with the Pythons, who were propheties entering a altered state of consciousness, and through the god Apollo, to whom the place was dedicated. They answered those who sought them out when Charon went to this place. He asked if there was a wiser man in the world than Socrates. The answer was negative. Socrates was the wisest of all them. When Charon told his friends about this philosopher was extremely puzzled as he was fully aware that he knew nothing. According to Plato, he asked himself, what does the god mean? And what hidden meaning does the answer have? I am not aware of being wise or unwise. What does he mean by declaring me the wisest? Curious and keen to unravel the oracle's world, he decided to seek out an acquaintance of his who was a politician and whom he considered to be wise after talking to him. The Athenian philosopher realized that the politician was not so wise because he did not recognize the limits of his own ignorance. Socrates concluded, I am wiser than this man, and it is probable that neither of us knows anything important, but he believes he knows something and he is not I. I do not, it do not suppose I know either.
Socrates later consulted other politicians as well as talking to poets and craftsmen who were considered wise, but contact with these people led him to the same conclusion he had reached. With the first man he had talked to that day knew nothing, although they thought the opposite. Socrates became well known in Athens, and one of the main reasons for this was the Socratic method, which consisted of an inquiry process through which the philosopher approached certain individuals, rich or poor, young or in places such as gymnasiums, public squares, and banquets, questioning them on subjects that were often apparently simple and straightforward for the interlocutors, but which soon became uncertain when the people he approached answered a question. Socrates deconstructed these answers with new questions, pointing out mistakes and inconsistencies. Often the interlocutor would learn that they did not know what they initially believed they understood. Aimed so many unanswered questions, this self reflection allowed people to learn more about this issue and take a new perspective on the subject discussed with Socrates. The philosopher wisely used dialectics, which is the art of discourse, as a linguistic tool in the search for truth. Often, this helped people to realize that some concepts accepted a prior as true after being examined critically and deeply were false, and these would finally recognize their ignorance. Socrates compared this method to the profession of midwife, which, as we said at the beginning of the video, was that of his mother. He understood that this philosophical approach helped to foster innovative ideas since these already existed within people, and he only helped to give birth to them as if he were a kind of obstetrician. This labor performed by the thinker, initially questioning his fellow citizens and showing contradictions and misunderstandings in their reasoning, then making them change their perspectives on what they thought they knew, was called music. It's important to stress that an Xenophon says Socrates never received any payment for his teaching, unlike the sophists. Another interesting point in his philosophy is the question of virtue. The most valuable of all goods, Socrates believed that the man who possessed knowledge was both virtuous and incapable of evil, since evil was brought about by the ignorant who did not know what was good. For this reason, there was a relationship between morality and knowledge. In other words, if we know what good is, there is no reason to do evil. At 60 scores was accused and condemned in Athens in Apology. Plato recounted the master's allegations before the three accusers, Annius, Malleus, and Lysin, or as well as other people present during the conviction.
According to Plato, Socrates was accused of corrupting youth and not believing in the gods that the people believe in, but in the new deity Xenophon, who also described the process of Socrates' sentencing and death, emphasizes how the Athenian philosopher felt wronged Xenophon, and Plato mentions Socrates' admirable peace before death. During the trial, Socrates told those present that he had a divine mission which began in childhood and when he used to hear a voice inside him. This voice would be that of his demon. Historically, the word demon has been given multiple meanings in Socrates' case. It was a kind of genius or cultural guide who spoke to the philosopher and gave him suggestions on what to do. Socrates was eventually sentenced to death and forced to ingest hemlocks. A strong precedent for Plato underlines the master's admirable and inspiring composure and courage when faced with death. The man appeared to me happy in his manner and speech. He faced death with fearlessness and nobility, and at the end of his word, he described Socrates as the best, wisest, and most of them meant Socrates was one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Most writers who quote him consider him extremely wise. His philosophical legacy is hugely significant and has influenced other subsequent thinkers. Among other things, teaches us to be better analyze our thoughts and to have a more critical perspective on the surrounding reality. Through the study, we realize how important is it to always maintain a critical stance toward the world and how important humility is in our quest for knowledge. Plato was a illustrious Greek philosopher whose writings which have survived to the day and rendered his ideas. Immortal Plato was born in Athens around 427 or 428 BC and came from a noble family. His father was Ariston and his mother was Pericon. The philosopher had two brothers, Adanus and Glon, and a sister called Poon. His father died when the thinker was still young, and his death Pericon remarried. And from this union Anapon and few people know that Plato was a nickname. The famous philosopher name was Aristocles, the same as his grandfather. Plato comes from the Greek Platon, which means great or broad. This nickname was given to him by his wrestling coach because of his physical size. Plato lived during a political turbulent period in Athens when the Pelican War took place. A conflict between Athens and Sparta also witnessed the period when Athens was defeated by Sicily and witnessed an important political change when democracy lost ground to oligarchy. This hectic time was certainly an influence on his musings and ethics and politics. Plato received a good education in his childhood and youth. He studied a variety of subjects such as music, history, geometry, and arithmetic. Among others, throughout his youth, he excelled ethically in his early philosophical studies. Through contact with the contemporary Crates, he gained an interest in Socratic, Helicrates of Ephesus, and also later studied the philosophers of Eleatic school including Parmenides, who was particular interest to Plato at around 20 years old. Plato became a pupil of his remarkable philosopher Socrates. The master had a peculiar demeanor to his contemporaries, dressing sharp and frequently public places. He very questioned the most diverse individual Plato became Socrates' pupil, and though his master wrote nothing down as faithful, Epictetus noted much information about him today, a great deal of what we know about Socrates' personal life and work come from the works of his pupil. He was interested in pursuing a political career when his master Socrates was sentenced and executed. He became deeply illusioned with the local government and began to chart another course for his life after Socrates' death. Plato left his hometown and moved to Myra city, west of Athens, in 388 BC. When he was about 40 years old, he spent a period in Italy where he tried to establish a contact with the Pythagoreans, followers of philosophy. Founded by the pre-Socratic Pythagoreans of Samos, around the same time he also went to Cyrene, now Libya, and to Egypt, particularly important country where Plato came into contact with and gained knowledge from local Socrates and prophets. But the document about the philosopher visit to these two places are uncertain. On one occasion, while in Italy, Plato met the tyrant who invited the philosopher to visit Cyrus in Sicily, hoping that the Athenian thinker would become his personal advisor. Plato hoped to present his thoughts and influence the ruler with his political philosophy, but the relationship between the two quickly became troubled with the uncomfortable disagreements between them. Dionysus becomes so angry with the Greek thinker that he sold him as a slave to a Spartan from Aina island near Athens. But Plato escaped with the help of Artet of Sian and returned to Athens during this troubled time in Italy. Plato became friends with the Greek philosopher Dion, a relative of Dionysus. Plato returned from his first trip to Sicily was important. At around 40 years old, he founded the philosophical school called the Academy near Athens. The name the Academy comes from Academus, an important Athenian hero. The place was associated with muses, entities bound to the god Apollo, one of the main and most worried deities in ancient Greece. Plato is said to be have charged nothing to those frequented the place. Another interesting fact is that at least two women are believed to have taken part in the meetings of this philosophical school. In his written document, Plato explored different areas of philosophical research, such as etymology, politics, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. Among the many aspects of his philosophy, the most important and well known are the theory of forms and the myth of the cave. The theory of forms is one of the cornerstones of Platonic philosophy. This topic not only appears in one book but in several of his texts. Plato considered there to be two realms where the plane he calls the spiritual realm is characterized by being immutable, eternal, and stable, but the physical realm, one of we apprehend through our sense, is defined by how mutable things are this is in the world. Appearances of imperfect copies of what exists in spiritual realm, where the essences truth in themselves are to be found in others' words. In the spiritual realm, things are absolute, but on the second plane in physical realm, they only exist in appearance, because their primary roots are in the spiritual realm. That which exists in the sensory sphere is a copy of that which pertains to the spiritual realm. The true cause of things is the physical realm, is supersensible. In other words, everything that exists in the world which we live as a shadow of what occurs in spiritual realm. To illustrate this thought, Plato wrote the famous myth or the allegory of cave. Imagine a cave with several prisoners who since birth have been chained there facing only in one direction, seeing shadows cast by objects behind them lit by a bonfire. These prisoners believe that the shadows are reality. When a prisoner frees himself and leaves the cave, he is initially dazzled by the sunlight and the true reality, but he understands and accepts this new perspective. He learns that the shadows he saw before were not things in themselves, but the man returned to the cave to share he has discovered, but the other prisoners ridicule him and refuse to believe his words. They remain inside, deluded, believing that the shadows were the truth itself, without knowing that the things themselves were not in that place. In this metaphor, the physical realm in the cave and the spiritual realm, that is, the reality itself, the source of everything related to the physical sphere, lies outside the cave. This allegory may also be interpreted in unusual ways and is even associated with other aspects of Platonic philosophy such as nosology, ethics, and politics. Although important, the theory of forms and the myth of the cave are only part of Plato's extensive and complex work, which covers studies on aesthetics, morality, reflection on love, and other subjects in 367 BC. Plato returned to Sicily. He tried to develop contacts with Dionysius II, who had succeeded his father. This was because the tyrant Dionysius the second had developed a taste for philosophy. He wanted to study with him, but as had happened years before, Plato's time in Sicily was frustrating and the meeting with the stubborn Dionysius II was not fruitful, and the disagreements arose between the two. But that wasn't the end of Plato's time in Sicily. In 361 BC, the Greek thinker returned to the city now, accompanied by his students Socrates, and this first there was further disagreements. The philosopher almost died trying to deal with the authoritarian Dionysius II, whose barbaric behavior remained unaltered. His friend Dion eventually won power but was assassinated in 353 BC. In 360 BC, Plato returned to Athens, where he remained busy until his death. Plato died in approximately 347 BCE, aged around 80, and was supposedly buried in or near the ground of his philosophical school's Plato's Academy. Was destroyed in 86 BC by Lucius Sua, a Roman officer who conquered the Greek city near that year. Not that only was the academy was destroyed, but the other part of the city as well, such as the philosophical school founded by Aristotle. Even after the academy was destroyed, the Platonic school continued to be taught until it was closed down in 529 AD by order of the Roman Emperor Justinian. In the 20th century, the location of the academy was found and now an archaeological site that can be visited free of charge by tourists. Plato's vast philosophical legacy continued to influence other renowned names in the history.